So excited to be sharing this as really the first kickoff for the 2026 conference coming up in Portland as a pre-conference breakout. And this is something new, and very excited that you all have joined us for this. Um, the Do have just a um, very loose agenda for our time together today. I've called this session "Calibrating the Lens of Self," and I'm going to, in the process of talking about this, define what I mean by self and what I mean by the lens and what I mean by calibrating. All of those things may conjure up images for you, and your images are probably not far off from what I'm hoping to do here. But the basic idea is, as we think about gathering, whether you're going to be able to join us in Portland in person or virtually, or you're just heading to work tomorrow, wherever it is that you are gathering, we show up to the world as this whole self, this whole person, this whole entity, and interact with others. And especially at a place like QCF, there are a lot of other selves that are sharing that space with us. There are a lot of other ideas of what it means to be a whole person and to show up in that space. And so the better we know ourselves, the better we understand ourselves, the better we understand that starting location of who we are, the um, the more success we set ourselves up for of interacting with others and interacting through the presence of God in that space. And so our agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to introduce myself, like I said, a little bit more formally in just a minute. We're going to talk about what I call flipping pyramids. And this is kind of taking the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and flipping it upside down, which is how a lot of us in the queer community kind of come into this idea of asking for and presenting our own needs. I'm going to talk about this concept of self that is, I call it grounding through curiosity, starting with my head in the clouds and how do I get out of the clouds and down into more tangible, practical spaces. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about peace and the self and the journey that I've had to understanding who I am and finding peace through pursuing this sense of wholeness and how that upbuilds in our lives as we learn to share and grow with it. And then we'll have some time for some question and response. A couple things about this format and about what we are doing here. It is going to be me talking for quite a bit. It is a lecture in a manner of speaking. It's also just me sharing. And I'm actually going to do this a little differently in that I'm going to play some music in the background. My voice, when I get into this lilting rhythm, can take on some ASMR qualities. I'm going to try and sometimes avoid that, and sometimes I'm going to lean into it and just let it be. And just invite you to grab hold of that space and hear what you can, receive what you can, hold on what you need to, let go of what you don't. Each of these concepts are concepts that I have developed as I have come to understand myself on this rather complex journey as a trans Christian intersex Baptist minister working through life. And I want to put them out here not as prescriptive to say, here's what you should go do, but rather as descriptive of how I have approached this journey. And one of the things that would bring me joy is if somewhere along the way you said, oh, you know what? It wasn't that, but it was this other thing that helped me find myself. And if you think of it between now and then, and if I see you in Portland or somewhere else along the way, and you come pull me aside and say, "Oh, you got me totally wrong, but you helped me find me," that would make my day. So, a couple things that we are not dealing with here. This is not doctrine. Um, it's not undoctrinal. There is doctrine that I have based it on from my own experience and education. But it's not prescriptive in the terms that doctrine might be prescriptive. It's not psychology. Again, it's rooted in some of the psychological studies that I have gone through in my course of education and learning. But I'm not proposing it as grounded in academic psychology as some might think of it. It's not proper theology. It's not an individual direct discussion about who God is and how God relates to us. Um, it is what I would call a poetic theology. So it is leaning into metaphors and leading into imagery to help us understand who we are in the context of a larger divine nature in the world around us. It is an invitation. It's a lot of invitation. I'm going to use the word I invite you, the phrase I invite you a lot over the next 30 minutes or so. And it is reflection. It's deep reflection for me as I contemplate and make space for this journey that God has brought me through. And it's an invitation for you to reflect on where you are, or maybe in that journey as you move through this time and space. So there would be times when I'm going to pause and invite you to just reflect on a screen. I'm going to leave the thoughts and the information on the screen there, and we're just going to sit in silence for maybe 30 seconds. I would invite you to write down any thoughts that you have, make notes of them however you'd like to make notes of them, and then I will move on. And then at the end, we're going to have a question and response time. And that'll be the opportunity to open the door a little wider to conversation. If you would like to turn your camera on that point and have join directly in the conversation, you're welcome to do that. I do invite you to consider all of the selves that are calibrating in this space together. And again, enter respectfully into that space, understanding that this is my journey, that I am offering freely and openly to you. If it doesn't resonate with you, that's okay. And I'm open to hearing that conversation. I'm open to hearing why you feel your path has been different, or your experience of God is different, or your experience of self is different, but invite you to do so respectfully. So we are just going to get grounded into this space. Any questions before I press on? Okay. Let me get back to that multitasking thing that I didn't finish a second ago. And I'm just going to invite you to, wherever you are, be comfortable, be gentle with yourself, be gentle with your soul, and open your heart and mind to what God might have for you in the next 30 minutes or so. And as I start this discussion, I'd really like to introduce myself in a little bit more full and complete capacity. I do go by the title Reverend. I don't expect people to call me that. Sometimes they do, and it's a little weird, but that's okay. I put it in my name, I put it on letters and on other identifying spaces, mostly to remind myself that I have taken a vow, that I have promised to the church, that I have promised to those who have entrusted me with what they would call the ministry of the gospel, the administration of truth and justice in the world. I've taken a vow to them to be gentle, to be kind, to be compassionate, to love mercy, to seek justice. And I hope to do that in this space with you right now. Most people know me as Laura Beth, and you can call me Laura Beth. You can call me LB if that's easier. My full name, legal name, is Laura Bethany, and it is a name that I chose for myself. Laura is a name that I have identified with in some level my entire life, even in dreams and my younger self. Others in the dreams would refer to me as Laura, and I can remember being very confused by that until I learned to love it and embrace it. And as I transitioned almost 11 years ago now, a little over 11 years ago now, I started understanding the name, and it comes from the description, or it comes from the laurel leaves, the laurel plants that the ancient Greeks and Romans would make their victory wreaths out of, like we see in the Olympics, or we see on returning generals and such. And it carried an air of accomplishment, an air of victory, of overcoming. And I wanted a name with that would signify a new life, that would signify resurrection. And I was reading in the New Testament as Jesus was responding to the news that his friend Lazarus had become ill. And upon coming closer to Lazarus' home, discovering that he had indeed passed, and then calling Lazarus out of the grave. And that story starts with Jesus came to the town of Bethany. And that name Bethany just resonated with me. And so the name Laura Bethany together to me means a victorious new life. And my last name is Buchleiter. And it wasn't a name that I thought I was going to keep. I thought that the Buchleiter family would not want to be associated with a trans woman. I was worried about my kids who share that name and what that might mean for them and our community to be associated with me. And so I was moving away from that name. But as my dad started to become more comfortable and understanding of why I was on this journey and taking the path that I was, he acknowledged some discomfort and some still lack of understanding at one point. But he said in a letter, a handwritten letter, that while he still didn't understand everything, the thing that might have made him the most sad is that I would walk away from the family name. And so with that invitation, I kept it, understanding that it is not representative of who I am. It is the name that is inherited through men in the family in this patriarchal system and culture. But it is a name that represents some heritage, that represents some spiritual and familial roots that are valuable to me, that in a place and a time where I will take and grab hold of any roots that I have, that I can. These are good and strong ones. So I am Reverend Laura Bethany Buchleiter, and it is wonderful to be with you here. Of the many things that I have learned about myself along this journey is that I have had to give myself permission to live a little bit backwards and sideways. That what I saw my peers growing and going through as I was coming up through life didn't necessarily match the path that I was on. And it was incredibly, utterly confusing through most of that time for me. And what I eventually realized is that I was taking the traditional pyramids of how we approach our needs, how we approach our development, and I was flipping it upside down. So, just a little bit of a quick refresher. The idea of needs, according to Maslow, and this is problematic on many levels. So, this is going all the way back to his original ideas, which have been rethought and reworked and remeshed into reality over the decades. But it basically that we start with our physiological needs: food, water, warmth, rest. We move into our safety needs: security and privacy and protection and shelter. Then we move into these social needs, this place of belonging and intimacy and friendship, and moving up through our esteem, where we are recognized. And in modern vernacular, we would say this is where we are seen and understood. And then we have the sense of self-actualization, the self-awareness of who we are in the world around us. And as we move up through that space, we call those the basic needs, the psychological needs, and then areas of self-fulfillment. But like I said, what I have found with myself and with so many other of my siblings in the queer community is that we tend to flip the pyramid. We go through it backwards. And instead of starting with our physiological needs, with that food, water, warmth, and rest, we start with this sense of awareness. We start with this self-actualization. But instead of self-fulfillment, we approach it and are conditioned to think of it as some sort of self-defense. We have to be aware of self. We have to know who we are in order to protect ourselves. Only after some grounding can we start to move from self-defense to self-awareness. And when we get into self-awareness, we can start accepting the recognition. We can start to see ourselves and allow ourselves to be seen. And only then do we start to accept a sense of belonging and intimacy and friendship. And it's only in that belonging that we start to find a sense of security. We start to feel safe. And that we then start to see ourselves even necessarily as worthy of pursuing these more physiological needs. I've seen this in myself. I see it in youth that I get to work with and talk to who have been experiencing homelessness and hunger, and was always curious as to why those physiological needs didn't really seem to bubble up to the same priority that we seem to think they should. It's because they didn't necessarily feel seen. They didn't really understand who they were in their embodied self to be pursuing those needs in the first place. And so as I started thinking about this hierarchy and this flip and this contrast, I realized that those going through the hierarchy of needs in a more traditional sense and those of us doing it backwards, if we met in the middle, we would connect at belonging. And so I reimagined this as an hourglass. So instead of thinking it as a top and a bottom, this is just some of us coming from one side of life and some of us coming from the other side of life. And if we can meet in the middle, in this sense of belonging, then we can start to see ourselves and we can start to see other selves as where we are on the journey. And we can usher people into those places of self-awareness that we have already experienced and that they may not have. And they can help us to find that sense of safety and those physiological needs that sometimes have eluded us. And that's when community becomes a collection of selves, a collection of whole people. I'm just going to pause there for about 30 seconds and let us think about that. Let us make any notes that we might have about where we are on this path of belonging, where our own self is as we relate to this structure. And as I started to think about myself engaging that world, as I started to think about myself taking everything that is going through my head as my head is up in the clouds, and not in the clouds in the sense of being absent-minded or flaky, which is often a label that I would give myself or was given by others, but up in the clouds, in this sense of dreaming and wondering. And so this clouds to me the sense of fulfillment, that top of the flipped pyramid, that far side of the hourglass, where I am living in my most actualized, understood sense of self. I find myself wondering and dreaming and visioning and creating a lot, but there is that movement, that pressure, that need to get down to those physiological needs, to put everything in motion, to put everything on the ground, to have it running in the streets, to plan and go and do and revise and build. And what I found was I was trying to go straight from wonderment to motion. I was trying to go straight from these plans and this doing to the dreaming and the visioning. And I just felt like there was something in the middle. I was missing that sense of belonging. And when I started to find a belonging is when I started to let myself be curious. When I let myself go from wonderment to curiosity, from curiosity into motion, and in that motion of the plannings and the revisions, to ask, to consult with people who have been down the path before, to sense, to allow that belonging to become a viable part of my life. The dreams and the visions grew and became more achievable and more tangible, not something off in the distance. And this is a cycle that I'm still working to condition myself to, but one that I have found a lot of joy and excitement in as I've done so. And this next section, talking about peace and the self, is where I'm going to lean into a little bit more of the poetic theology that I discussed earlier. Understanding ourselves in body, soul, and spirit, and finding a sense of wholeness as we live through love, grace, faith, and hope. And I'm going to share these images and offer these metaphors and offer some definitions of words that we probably feel like we know. And once again, invite you to receive them for what they are. They are my life in poetry. They are, I think, a reflection of what God calls us to and what has been outlined for us through the Christian scriptures. But again, not doctrine. This isn't prescriptive. This is an invitation. So I'm going to start with this image. The triquetra is a familiar symbol to many of us in this three-sided imagery that often represents the Trinity, the triune nature of God, as we understand God in Christ incarnate, in God creator, and in Spirit, or the mother, the guide, the counselor. And the arrows we'll understand in a minute. The sword in the middle, and if the sword image is shocking to you, I invite you to take a breath, and I own and receive that it's not an image that many of us might necessarily embrace or lean into for ourselves. I will tell you the symbolism comes from the poetry of Genesis and the Eden myth, where there once was this sense of wholeness between divine and creation, creator and created. And in that mythology, after a break, after a separation happened, there was this angel placed at the gate holding a fiery sword, separating something. And what I'd like to suggest was being separated there is, in one sense, time as we know it began. And death and work and labor, aging, started being talked about in the context of that myth. And on the other side of that was where divinity still rested, and we'll call that eternity. And there's a lot of ways we can think about eternity, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll think about eternity as a time different than our own. Maybe it is a space of existence without time. Maybe it is with no beginning and no end. Maybe it has its own sense of time that is just something different than we understand. The important thing is it's a different experience than what we go through on a daily basis. The temporal and the eternal. And if you'll notice, in this little section over here is one leg of this triquetra that exists completely in the space of time. And I'm going to call that body. And what we're going to do here is paint a picture of a whole self in a reflection of the triune God. And so we start with this space that is over here completely existing in time, calling that body. And over here, the reflection of that is completely existing in eternity, and we're going to call that soul. This is the part of us that exists in that space with God Creator. And then this third part of that triquetra is spirit. And it is bridging the gap between time and eternity. And again, the reflection of the Trinity, Christ incarnate, God creator, outside of time, creator of time, and Spirit bridging the gap, Holy Spirit sent to bridge that gap between these spaces. And in that space, part of our challenge is that we often find ourselves separating body from soul and spirit. That could be that we, in our spiritual journeys, have not explored the full existence and idea of self. It could be that like many of us who have experienced gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia, or even a lot of the teachings and misunderstandings of purity and the evilness of the flesh, we separate the body out from soul and spirit, and we limit our experience of wholeness in that context. And so part of the journey that I personally embarked on in bringing this lens of self into focus was asking the question, how do I bring body in communion with soul and spirit? And the first thing I had to do is acknowledge that they are all one, that I exist in the Imago Dei, in the image of God, as all three of these things: body, soul, and spirit. And so many of our narratives tend to start right up here and trying to push ourselves into this idea of our spiritual lives. But when we take a breath and we look at the narrative that God has laid out in Scripture through the text, what has played out in my life, I begin to understand that the narrative actually starts with love. The narrative starts with love. And for the sake of our discussion here, I'm going to call love the essence of God in motion. Love is everything that is divine, moving toward and in and through and around us. It is what makes the universe blossom. It is what pulls us into this space of understanding. It's why we have a gut instinct. It's why we have an invitation to understand that there is more to us than this temporal existence. And when we encounter that love, we get to receive it as a gift, and we're going to call that gift grace. And again, for the sake of this discussion, I want to define grace as a gift of love shared in or through wholeness. So at this moment, grace is shared in us through the wholeness of God as the gift of God's love, encountering us as it moves through the universe. And out of grace, we are given faith. And this faith then is what allows us to move through spirit into understanding more of the depth of who we are. Faith is often talked about as something that we take as a leap. But I see faith as something that is a next part in this fluid motion of love and grace in our lives. And so for the sake of our discussion, I want to invite you to think of faith as movement toward love we have yet to experience. Love is the essence of God in motion. Grace is the gift of God encountered in wholeness. Faith then is our movement toward the love that we have yet to know fully and to experience. And as we experience that, as we come to understand and engage the love of God, we start to experience hope. And for the sake of this imagery, I want to invite you to think of hope as the confidence that love is going to endure. The confidence that what we experience in faith when we encounter love, it's not a fleeting thing. It is something that is going to be restorative. It is something that is going to continue to meet us along this path and along this journey. And so as we move from love to grace, to faith, to hope, toward the love that is going to endure, the cycle starts to repeat itself. And instead of being stuck in this space where body is disconnected from who we are, it starts to create this sense of wholeness and understanding, so that this gift of grace isn't just something we receive inside of us, it's something that starts to flow out through us. And we can start to create this understanding and belonging, to offer the belonging that becomes community. so that our self can show up whole in a space, not perfect, not having figured it all out. One of the phrases that I've adopted, motto, life slogan, whatever you'd like to call it in this context, is that I am whole and seeking wholeness. I am able to be complete and whole in the image of God, and I can also be growing and seeking more, upbuilding through this work. And what I found that as that wholeness comes about, and that I have moments of resting in that, I start to experience peace. I start to experience peace as the byproduct of this upbuilding process. Peace isn't the lack of conflict. Peace isn't complete agreement with everyone around me. Peace isn't even complete harmony with the universe. Peace is a byproduct of the wholeness that I am given through the work of the Spirit by the grace of God in my life. I'm going to invite you to sit with that image for, again, about 30 seconds. I'm going to recognize that some of those words might come to you with a lot of baggage. That the self that you bring to this space today might have had love, specifically the love of God, shared with you in a way that was harmful. That you might have been offered grace, but with great conditions and strings attached. That faith might have been something that you were supposed to adopt in order to fix what everyone else saw as broken. And that as a result of that, hope and peace and other things like joy, gentleness, kindness felt like distant realities. But as we engage this concept of understanding self, I invite you to reclaim the words. I invite you to find new space for yourself in the context of this bigger, more beautiful universe. And as I invite you to move from my own metaphors and my own thoughts and the journey that I hope will inspire one for you, I invite you to come back to your own space, to wherever it is in time that you are sitting right now. whatever now is to you, wherever now is to you. Breathe in the air that is offered to you. And celebrate all that is. And all the love that can be. And I'm going to open the conversation now. We have 10, 15 minutes. There is no obligation or no pressure or expectation for any engagement, but would absolutely love and welcome it.
Well, my first thought was when you were talking about the upside down pyramid and the hourglass and stuff. I'm both queer and neurodivergent, and I was thinking this upside down pyramid feels really relevant also to the neurodivergent experience. I feel like oftentimes my personal basic needs of caring for myself get neglected, and I'm busy trying to meet my needs for belonging, for self-worth and self-esteem, for figuring out my purpose. It's like my focus goes towards those things because they feel like oxygen to me. And
yes,
then my like basic self-care is like a struggle. And I not like so when I was looking at this pyramid of these hourglass, I was like, wow, that's so I've never seen it framed like that before, but it resonates so deeply.
great, thank you. Not by
Can I
accident.
also oh,
Yes, I
oh
was just going to say not by accident that the intersection of neurodivergence and that space with my personal experience and that of my family and everything. So thank you for acknowledging and highlighting that. And you had something else you're gonna.
that's awesome. Yeah, I also wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if maybe you could give like an illustration of what it might look like to go from wonderment through curiosity into motion, because I'm having a hard time comprehending that process.
Yes. Um, so part of my neurospiciness shows up when I forget that people don't live in my dream space with me. And so I will have a vision and a plan and an idea and take it straight from out of my head and try and put it in the world and get confused as to why people aren't on track with me. Um, so, for example, I write music and I collaborate with others in writing music. And so I have this song in my head and these lyrics and this melody, and I come in and I bring my collaborators into the space and I say, okay, everybody jump on board. But I haven't really stopped to see where people are in the process. And in the process of music collaboration, for example, a curiosity is, how is everybody today? Where is your creative energy right now? What can we do to kind of all get on the same space? Um, what other music have you been listening to that might be influencing you at this moment? And what might that look like for you? And then we move into that um, plan and go and do together. And then from that, we can step back into this. Well, what if we all went back and like researched a little bit more of our own instruments or of our own work and the um, yes, I mean the rec- the recording of this will be available. Um, And I will see about making the slides available with that as well. Thank you for asking, and thank you for joining us. So, yeah, so we get curious, and then we get back into that dream and vision together phase, and the cycle starts to repeat itself. Does that help?
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of
Okay,
sense. Thank you.
sure. Any other thoughts or questions?
Had another question, but I wanted to let others go first.
Nope, go for it.
Um, um, I am curious how you would define spirit and soul distinctly from each other.
Yes, great question. And a lot of people use the body, mind, soul language. I'll talk about why I don't do that in a minute. But spirit, again, is that bridge between the temporal and the eternal. So soul exists completely in that eternal space. Much like we think of God creator existing in completely that eternal space, which is why it was necessary for Christ incarnate to come and exist in the temporal space with us. Spirit then bridges the gap for us between that temporal and eternal space, and kind of is the conversation broker sometimes between soul and body. In that capacity, the counselor, the nurturer, the mother of that Trinitarian self. Um, Again, much in the imagery of that we have of the Holy Spirit in Scripture. I don't use the mind language because I see in so much of our psychology and our understanding and work around mind, even mindfulness, is good, solid work toward how to exist and function in the temporal space. Even understanding the psychology of the mind is a physical, scientific exercise. And so, mind to me is maybe a space between. It's where body starts to move toward that spirit, but it is still within the context of that temporal space. So, and also, when people take my thoughts and put the mind, body, soul language to it, if it works for them.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yep. Bless you, and thank you for being here.